The sharp buzz of electric clippers filled the air, drowning out the distant hum of city traffic. The cold metal pressed against her scalp, and then, a violent rip. Thick, curly strands of hair tumbled down onto the pavement, lifeless and scattered like fallen leaves. The weight of humiliation pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She wanted to scream, but her throat locked up. She could feel the stares, the quiet murmurs of bystanders who watched but did nothing. "You think you can just walk around like you belong here," the officer sneered, his grip tightening on the back of her neck. "Looking like that? Dressing like that? You little thief, I'm not a thief." Her voice cracked, raw from the lump in her throat. "I was just waiting for my mom." His laugh was cruel, sharp. "Your mom? Please. And what, she's a lawyer? A doctor?" He glanced at the courthouse behind her, scoffing. "You people don't belong in places like this. You should be grateful I'm teaching you some respect before it's too late." The sound of the clippers roared again, slicing through another chunk of her hair. She gasped as the cold air touched her scalp. The crowd around them shifted, eyes darting away, some pulling out their phones but no one stepping in. "Please, stop," she begged, her small hands reaching up, but he shoved them away like swatting a fly. "Stop." The officer's voice dripped with amusement. "You should be thanking me. No more hiding behind this mess. No more thinking you can just blend in where you don't belong." Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She clenched her fists at her sides, her entire body trembling. She had done nothing wrong. The humiliation burned deeper than the sharp sting on her scalp. People were watching. So many people were watching. A woman gasped nearby. "Isn't that," then, suddenly, a car door slammed. The sharp click of high heels against pavement cut through the tension like a gunshot. A voice, filled with ice and fire, rang out so forcefully it silenced the entire street. "What the hell do you think you're doing to my daughter?" The world stopped. The officer froze, his hands still gripping the clippers, his breath catching in his throat. The gathered crowd turned their heads all at once, eyes widening as they recognized the woman storming toward them. The air shifted. The very ground seemed to vibrate under her fury. The once powerful officer, so full of arrogance and control, paled. The sneer on his face vanished in an instant. His grip on the girl loosened as realization dawned upon him, a realization so terrifying that his own body betrayed him, stepping back, ever so slightly, as if the force of the woman's presence alone was pushing him away. "Madam Judge," someone in the crowd murmured. A whisper. A ripple of recognition. The judge had arrived. And the officer? He had just publicly assaulted the daughter of the most powerful woman in that courthouse. The weight of the moment sank in. The silence was suffocating. The judge's eyes flicked to her daughter, her baby, standing there, stripped of her dignity, her beautiful curls littering the ground like discarded trash. Her chest rose and fell with rapid breaths, her hands shaking, her lips pressed together to stop them from quivering. A fire ignited in her mother's gaze, a rage so deep it could swallow the world whole. The officer stammered, his fingers twitching, his mind scrambling for an explanation. I was just," she was, on the ground. Now. The words were not a request. The officer swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Ma'am, now." No one had ever spoken to him like that before. No one had ever challenged him like that before. His hands shook. For the first time in his life, the man who had spent years abusing his badge, humiliating innocent people, felt the weight of true fear. He opened his mouth to argue, to protest, to regain control of the situation, but then, the cameras. Phones everywhere. This wasn't just a small incident anymore. This wasn't just another day of unchecked power. This was public. A scandal. A career-ending mistake. And worst of all, The judge wasn't just any judge. She was a woman who had built her entire career on justice. A woman who knew the law better than anyone. A woman who, in mere seconds, could bring his entire existence crashing down. He stepped back. Too late. The fall had already begun. And what happened next would shake the entire city to its core. Before we start this powerful story, we want to make something clear: Plow of Twist stands against all forms of racism. To every black viewer watching, we see you, we stand with you, and we believe in justice. This story is a reminder that no injustice goes unanswered. Now, get ready for a story filled with twists, emotion, and redemption. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a powerful story like this. Enjoy the story. Let's begin. The morning air in Baltimore, Maryland, carried a lingering chill, the kind that clung to the skin despite the bright sun peeking through the clouds. It was a Monday, the kind of Monday that felt slow, dragging itself over the city like a heavy, invisible fog. Cars honked in the distance, people shuffled in and out of coffee shops, and the courthouse, a massive structure of cold gray stone, its towering pillars casting long shadows over the steps below, buzzed with the daily shuffle of justice. Some people entered with confidence, others with hesitation, but none of them expected what was about to unfold that morning. At the heart of it all was Zuri Parker, a 12-year-old girl with skin as deep and rich as the earth, and eyes that held far more wisdom than a child her age should have carried. She was small for her age, but she had an unshakable presence, the kind that made people take a second glance. She wasn't loud, wasn't the type to demand attention, she didn't need to. It was in the way she carried herself, her back straight, her head high, the quiet intelligence behind her gaze. She had grown up in a world that constantly tried to shrink her, but she refused to make herself smaller. That morning, she was waiting for her mother outside the courthouse, just like she did on days when there was no school. She leaned against one of the pillars, lost in the pages of a thick, hardcover book about American law, a book that her mother had given her months ago, telling her, "Know your rights, baby. Know them better than they do." She took those words seriously. She was young, but she understood far more than people gave her credit for. Her mother, Judge Vanessa Parker, was one of the most respected judges in the state, a woman who had fought her way into that courthouse through nothing but grit and brilliance. She was feared and admired in equal measure, the kind of woman who spoke and made the whole room listen. She had spent years dismantling the systems that tried to keep people like her daughter down, and she had done so with an unrelenting fire. Zuri had spent her whole life watching her mother fight, and in many ways, she had already begun preparing herself for her own battles. She had no idea her next battle was seconds away. Across the street, pacing with an air of arrogance that seemed almost practiced, was Officer Daniel Hayes. A man who wore his badge like a weapon rather than a symbol of protection. He was one of those officers, the kind whose uniform felt like a personal throne, who thrived off the power that came with it. He was broad-shouldered, his face set in an almost permanent sneer, eyes scanning the streets not for threats, but for opportunities. Opportunities to remind people like Zuri of their place. Zuri barely noticed him at first. She had learned, from an early age, to ignore the way certain men in uniform watched her. But then, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. A young black boy, no older than 10, was standing near the courthouse steps, fidgeting nervously as he searched through his pockets. Zuri could tell, he was probably looking for bus money. It was such a small, ordinary moment, until it wasn't. Officer Hayes's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Hey! Hands where I can see them." Zuri looked up, heart sinking. The boy froze, eyes going wide. "What's in your pockets?" Hayes demanded, his tone sharp, his stance immediately aggressive. The boy stammered, I was just, you think you can come around here and steal from people?" Zuri felt her pulse quicken. She had seen this before. Too many times. The way a small act, something as simple as looking for change, could turn into a crime when the person doing it had skin like hers. The boy was shaking, his eyes darting between the officer and the people around them. No one was stepping in. They never did. Zuri couldn't stay silent. "He's not stealing," she said, stepping forward before she could think better of it. Her voice was calm, steady. "He's looking for his money." Officer Hayes turned to her slowly, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, there was almost amusement on his face, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "And who the hell do you think you are?" he asked, stepping toward her. Zuri squared her shoulders. "Someone who can see exactly what you're doing." The words were dangerous, and she knew it. But she also knew her mother had taught her better than to stay silent in the face of injustice. Hayes let out a slow, deliberate chuckle. "You kids," he muttered. "No respect." Then, before she could react, he reached for her wrist. The grip was tight, tighter than it needed to be. "Let go of me," she snapped, twisting, but he held firm. "You think you're smart, huh?" His voice was low, almost mocking. "Walking around here, acting like you own the place. Dressed like that." His eyes flicked over her hoodie, her jeans, ordinary clothes, but in his eyes, a uniform of suspicion. Zuri tried to pull away, panic rising, but then, he grabbed her by the hair. Everything stopped. The grip was rough, unforgiving, and then came the unmistakable sound, the mechanical buzz of electric clippers. The sound paralyzed her. And then, cold metal pressed against her scalp. A sharp vibration. A chunk of her curls tumbled to the pavement. Laughter. Mockery. People stared. Some pulled out their phones, but no one stopped him. "You think that nappy mess makes you special?" Hayes muttered. "Let's fix that." Zuri's chest tightened, tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had done nothing wrong. She could hear the murmurs in the crowd, people whispering, recognizing her, but still no one did anything. And then, a car door slammed. A voice, sharp, commanding, thunderous. A voice that shattered the air like a gunshot. "What the hell do you think you're doing to my daughter?" The world shifted. Officer Hayes froze. Every pair of eyes turned. And in that moment, one single, agonizingly slow moment, Hayes realized his mistake. Because this wasn't just any girl. This wasn't just another black child for him to terrorize. This was Zuri Parker, the daughter of the most powerful judge in that courthouse. And his career, his entire life, was about to crumble before his eyes. The murmurs in the crowd had grown into a low, restless hum, a force that filled the space between the towering pillars of the courthouse and spilled onto the streets of Baltimore. People were watching, some with phones raised, others frozen in disbelief, their expressions shifting from shock to a slow-burning fury. The tension in the air thickened, wrapping itself around Officer Daniel Hayes like an iron grip, pressing against his skin, making the uniform that once made him feel untouchable suddenly suffocating. He could feel the weight of the moment in a way he had never felt before. This wasn't just a bad day. This wasn't just another routine show of force against a child who couldn't fight back. This was different. Because Judge Vanessa Parker was different. She didn't yell. She didn't curse or let her emotions unravel into chaos. That would have been easier to handle, that, he was used to. The rage of black mothers, the desperate cries of families, the helpless anger of those who knew the system would never side with them. He had seen it all before, ignored it all before. But this? This icy, controlled fury, this calculated precision. It was something else entirely. And it terrified him. Vanessa stood still, her breathing even, her face carved from stone, as if she were deliberately stretching the moment, letting it settle in, letting it become unforgettable. Her daughter's curls still littered the ground, stark against the concrete, a silent reminder of what he had done. And in that silence, in that moment where everything felt on the verge of snapping, she moved. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers steady as she dialed. Chief Reynolds. Yes. This is Judge Parker. Her voice was smooth, unreadable, carrying the kind of weight that made men listen before they even thought to argue. I need you at the courthouse. Immediately. A pause. Because one of your officers just violated my daughter's civil rights in front of a crowd of witnesses, and you and I both know exactly what kind of disaster that is about to turn into if you don't handle it personally. A longer pause. A faint smirk touched her lips, but there was nothing amused about it. Good. See you in 5 minutes. She ended the call, slipping her phone back into her pocket as she turned her gaze back to Hayes, who had barely moved. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting between her, the crowd, the other officers, his own panicking reflection in the courthouse window. He wanted to run. She could see it in the way his fingers twitched, the way his feet shifted, as if his own body was trying to drag him away from the inevitable. But there was no running from this. Ma'am, another officer, younger, hesitant, took a cautious step forward. Let's calm things down. There's no need to escalate the situation. Vanessa's head turned slowly, her eyes locking onto him, and he froze in place, his Adam's apple bobbing. Escalate? Her voice was sharp, but still controlled. Tell me, officer. Do you think this situation needs more escalation than an armed officer shaving the head of a 12-year-old girl outside a courthouse? He faltered, his lips parting, but no sound came out. Because there was no right answer. No justification. No excuse. Hayes stammered, his voice suddenly hoarse, cracking under the weight of the shifting power in the air. It wasn't like that. I was handling a situation, and she what, Officer Hayes? Vanessa's voice sliced through him like a scalpel, each word precise, surgical, leaving him exposed. She stood up for another child. She questioned your authority. She existed in a space you didn't think she belonged in. Tell me, what exactly was your justification for putting your hands on my daughter? He felt like he was drowning. And the worst part? The entire city was watching. The distant sound of approaching sirens cut through the thick tension, and for the first time in his career, Hayes felt something cold settle in his gut, a feeling he had never experienced before. A feeling close to fear. Vanessa tilted her head, studying him, her expression unreadable. And then, in a slow, measured movement, she crouched beside Zuri. Her fingers brushed gently over the uneven patches of hair on her daughter's head, her touch light but infinitely strong. Are you okay? Her voice softened, but the fury behind it was still there, simmering beneath the surface. Zuri had held herself together longer than most could have, but now, up close, Vanessa could see the cracks. The tension in her jaw, the way she was holding back the emotion, the slight tremble in her fingers. But she nodded, swallowing hard. I will be, she whispered. But he's not gonna get away with this, right? Vanessa's smile was small, but it wasn't kind. Not this time, baby, she murmured. Not this time. The sirens grew louder. The crowd leaned in. Hayes stood frozen, watching as the inevitable came for him, fast and merciless. Chief Reynolds arrived just as the sky above began to darken, thick clouds rolling in, casting a gray shadow over the courthouse steps. He stepped out of his car with the kind of expression that made other officers tense, his gaze flicking from Vanessa to Hayes, then to the mass of phones still recording. He already knew. This wasn't going away. This wasn't something that could be buried, smoothed over, turned into just another case of misconduct swept under the rug. This was about to become a spectacle. Vanessa stood, turning to face him as he approached. He didn't look happy, but he looked resigned. Judge Parker, he greeted stiffly. I heard there was an incident. Vanessa arched a brow, arms folding over her chest. An incident? Is that what we're calling it? She stepped aside, revealing her daughter, the uneven patches of hair, the raw, exposed humiliation written across her face. "This isn't an incident, Chief. This is a crime." Hayes snapped out of his daze, his voice rising in desperation. "Chief, I was just, save it." Reynolds's voice was flat, tired. He turned back to Vanessa, rubbing a hand over his face. "I assume you want this handled immediately." Vanessa's smile was razor-sharp. "Oh, Chief," she said, tilting her head just slightly. "I want so much more than that." The handcuffs were unlatched from an officer's belt. The weight of the moment pressed down on Hayes like a crushing force. The final blow was coming. And he could see it now, clearly, sharply, devastatingly. Everything he had done. Everything he had thought he could get away with. It was over. But Vanessa? She was just getting started. The air inside the courthouse was heavy, thick with something far beyond tension. It was expectation, a charged silence that stretched across the walls, creeping into every corner, pressing down on everyone in the room. The courtroom was packed, every seat occupied, every standing space filled with people who had watched, recorded, and now came to witness what came next. The weight of it settled into Officer Daniel Hayes's chest like a stone, suffocating, crushing. His hands were clenched into fists, his jaw tight, but no amount of tension in his body could hold back the reality of the moment. He was no longer the man in control. He sat at the defendant's table, shoulders squared, but the bravado that once lived there was gone. The uniform he had once worn with unshakable arrogance had been stripped from him, replaced by a stiff suit, a pathetic attempt to cling to the authority that had slipped through his fingers. His lawyer sat beside him, whispering something, but Hayes could barely hear it over the buzzing in his own skull. At the front of the courtroom, seated behind the bench, Judge Vanessa Parker was the picture of composed, effortless power. She had handled cases that shook the city, had passed sentences that made headlines, had built a legacy of justice that could not be ignored. But today, she was more than a judge. She was a mother. And today, justice was personal. Zuri sat in the first row, her head held high despite the uneven patches of her hair, a visible scar left behind by Hayes's cruelty. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers intertwined so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. But her eyes, those eyes were fierce. They did not waver. They did not flinch. She stared straight ahead, watching, waiting. The jury had already been seated, the murmurs dying down as the bailiff called for silence. The trial was not meant to be long, the evidence was undeniable, the witnesses were many, and the crime had been committed in front of an audience too large to ignore. But still, the weight of it stretched, every second dragging Hayes closer to the reality he had tried to outrun. Then, the moment came. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman with a voice that could cut through steel, rose from her seat. She did not hesitate, did not waste time with pleasantries or formalities. "Officer Hayes, let's go straight to the point," she said, her tone steady, slicing through the room like a blade. "Do you deny that, on the morning of October 17th, outside this very courthouse, you forcibly detained a 12-year-old girl without just cause?" Hayes shifted, his throat dry, his pulse pounding against his skull. His lawyer had told him to choose his words carefully, to keep his responses measured. He had been warned, do not appear defensive, do not lose your temper, do not let them see you unravel. "I was acting in accordance with," "You were acting in accordance with what?" the prosecutor interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "With standard police procedure. Is that your claim?" Hayes hesitated. Because they both knew that was a lie. The prosecutor turned, walking toward the jury, her heels clicking against the floor. "We have dozens of witnesses. We have multiple video recordings. We have a child whose dignity was stripped away in broad daylight. And yet, despite all of that, Officer Hayes still believes he can talk his way out of accountability." She turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "Tell me, officer, when you grabbed Zuri Parker and forcibly cut her hair, what law were you upholding?" Hayes's jaw locked, his teeth grinding together. He knew what she was doing. She wanted him to snap, to lash out, to show the courtroom exactly who he was. And for a second, he almost did. For a second, the old arrogance, the unchecked entitlement, the years of getting away with everything, almost pushed him to speak without thinking, to let the anger spill out in a way he couldn't take back. But then, his eyes flicked toward Judge Parker, her stare unmoving, unforgiving. He thought about the jury, the cameras, the city watching, waiting. He thought about the fact that no matter how desperately he wanted to control this narrative, the power had already slipped from his hands. His voice stuck in his throat, his hands curling against his knees. It was a mistake. The words felt foreign coming from his mouth, like something bitter and unfamiliar. A mistake. The prosecutor's tone was sharp, incredulous. "Tell me, Officer Hayes, how does one accidentally assault a child in front of dozens of people?" His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, a silent warning. "Don't lose control." Hayes exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm, but inside, his stomach churned. The prosecutor turned, pacing the courtroom with deliberate slowness, letting the weight of her words settle over the jury. "The real question here isn't whether Officer Hayes is guilty. That much is obvious." She stopped, facing the jury directly. "The real question is whether we, as a city, as a society, are going to let him walk away from this like so many others before him have." She gestured toward Zuri. "This child will remember what happened to her for the rest of her life. She will carry the scars of that day in ways that none of us can fully understand. And Officer Hayes?" She turned back to him, her eyes narrowing. "He thinks he should be able to go home, go back to his life, pretend that none of this happened." The words hung in the air, stretching into the silence that followed. The jury exchanged glances. The weight of the unspoken truth settled onto their shoulders. Judge Parker finally leaned forward, her hands folded before her, her expression still unreadable. "Officer Hayes," she said, her voice measured, a slow, deliberate storm rolling in. "You have spent years believing that your badge made you untouchable. You have spent years believing that you would never answer for your actions. Today, that changes." The finality in her words sent a ripple through the room. The jury would deliver their verdict soon. And for the first time, Daniel Hayes understood what it felt like to be powerless. The jury had been sent to deliberate, but the weight of the inevitable already hung over the courtroom like a storm cloud, thick and suffocating, pressing down on every single person who sat in that room. No one spoke, but the silence wasn't empty, it was crowded with expectation, with anticipation, with the sheer force of justice creeping closer. Officer Daniel Hayes sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his fingers twitching against the polished wood, his face set in something close to defiance but betrayed by the sweat gathering at his temples. His lawyer had leaned in, whispering something in urgent, hushed tones, but Hayes wasn't listening anymore. His heartbeat had become an unbearable pounding in his ears, a relentless reminder that this was real. The courtroom was still packed, every seat filled, every wall lined with people standing, leaning in, waiting for the moment when this case, this spectacle, this reckoning, this inevitable fall from power, would reach its conclusion. Zuri sat beside her mother in the front row, her chin raised, her fingers no longer shaking as they rested in her lap. There was something unbreakable in her now, something that had been shattered in the moment her hair hit the pavement but had reformed into something even stronger, even more defiant. She wasn't looking at Hayes, she had stopped looking at him long ago. Instead, she watched her mother, watched the way Judge Vanessa Parker sat with the same effortless command she always had, but with something different in her eyes today. Something deeper, something personal. Then, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room creaked open. The jury had returned. The ripple of movement that passed through the room was almost imperceptible, a slow, collective inhale, as if every person had suddenly realized this was it. Hayes clenched his jaw so hard it hurt, his stomach twisting as the jurors filed back into their seats, their faces unreadable, their eyes refusing to meet his. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with sharp, dark eyes and a tension in her shoulders that suggested she understood exactly what this case meant, rose with an envelope in hand, her fingers steady as she passed it to the bailiff. Judge Parker, expression impassive, took the verdict and unfolded it with slow, deliberate care. There was no hurry, no rush. She knew what was written there before her eyes even skimmed over the words, and as she lifted her gaze back to the room, her voice came out smooth, unshaken, absolute. In the case of the state of Maryland versus Daniel Hayes, on the charge of aggravated assault against a minor, how does the jury find the defendant? The foreperson lifted her chin, her voice clear, ringing through the courtroom with the force of something irreversible. Guilty. The word landed like a thunderclap. For a second, the entire room froze in place, as if time itself had paused to absorb the magnitude of what had just happened. And then, like a dam breaking, it erupted, gasps, murmurs, a low, cascading wave of emotion spilling over the courtroom. Hayes's breath stuttered, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His lawyer turned toward him, lips moving, but Hayes wasn't hearing anything anymore. The word kept repeating, slamming into his skull like a relentless drumbeat. Guilty. 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 The prosecutor let out a slow breath, satisfied, while Zuri exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours, a weight she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying finally slipping from her shoulders. Vanessa didn't move, didn't react beyond the slightest tightening of her lips, her fingers pressing together in a way that only someone who had mastered restraint could notice. Order, she called, and the courtroom gradually quieted, the echoes of hushed voices still vibrating through the air. Her eyes found Hayes's, locking onto him with the full force of what came next. Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice unshaken, steady, and far too powerful to ignore. You have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. Do you have anything to say before sentencing is passed? There it was. The last opportunity. The final moment in which he could grasp at something, anything, to salvage himself. His fingers curled against the table, his mouth opening, but no words came out. His mind raced, clawed, searched for a way out, but there wasn't one. There never had been, not since the moment he had been caught on camera with his hands on that child, with her hair falling at his feet, with the whole world watching. He could feel the burning weight of every single pair of eyes in the room. And then, for the first time, his gaze shifted toward Zuri. She wasn't looking away. Her expression wasn't fearful or shaken or filled with the same humiliation that had consumed her that day outside the courthouse. She was looking at him the way he had looked at her that day, unmoved, unwavering. Like he was nothing. And somehow, that hit harder than the verdict itself. His mouth snapped shut. He had nothing left to say. Judge Parker gave him one more lingering look, something close to pity, but not quite reaching it, before her expression hardened once more. Very well, she said. Sentencing will be carried out immediately. The room held its breath. Daniel Hayes, for the charge of aggravated assault against a minor, you are hereby sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, followed by the permanent revocation of any and all law enforcement certifications. The sound that left Hayes's throat was something close to a gasp, close to a plea, but swallowed down before it could fully form. 7 years. He had seen men get less for worse. He had seen his own colleagues get away with so much more. But not this time. Not with the entire world watching. Vanessa straightened, hands resting lightly on the desk before her, voice calm and steady as she delivered the final words. Bailiffs, take him into custody. The scrape of the chair as Hayes was yanked to his feet was loud, abrupt, final. His hands were wrenched behind him, the click of handcuffs securing around his wrists filling the room like the sound of a door slamming shut. And maybe it was. Because for Daniel Hayes, the world had just gotten a whole lot smaller. The weight of it all settled in fully as he was led away, past the faces of people who had watched him fall, past the cameras that would plaster his downfall across every screen, past Zuri, who didn't even bother to turn her head as he passed. He was nothing now. And she? She was just beginning. The weight of the verdict still hung in the air, thick and suffocating, pressing against the walls of the courthouse, refusing to dissipate even as the gavel's echo faded. People were still seated, still processing, still gripping the armrests of their chairs as if the world had just shifted beneath them. It had. The words had been spoken, final and absolute, carving themselves into history, leaving no room for doubt, for reversal, for the tired, predictable outcome that so many had expected but had not received this time. Guilty. 7 years. The badge stripped away. The power revoked. The authority dismantled in real time. The system that had always bent to protect men like Daniel Hayes had, for once, turned against him, not because it wanted to, not because it was built for justice, but because this time, the weight of the evidence had been too massive to ignore, the spotlight too bright to turn away from, the public too enraged to pacify with weak apologies and empty reassurances. Zuri Parker sat perfectly still, her hands clasped together in her lap, her back straight, her breath even, her pulse no longer erratic, no longer chaotic, no longer racing with the same breathless disbelief that had consumed her on that day outside the courthouse, the day that had changed everything. She had waited for this moment, had imagined it, had envisioned what it would feel like to see the man who had humiliated her, stripped her of her dignity, reduced to nothing in the very courthouse where he had once believed himself untouchable. And now, it had happened. It had unfolded in front of her eyes, second by second, word by word, the slow unraveling of a man who had spent his life believing that consequences were something that happened to other people, to people without power, to people who couldn't fight back. He had never expected to be the one sitting there, facing a judge, facing a jury, facing the very laws he had twisted and manipulated to his advantage for years. And yet, here he was. The courtroom began to stir, a slow, cautious movement, people shifting in their seats, exhaling breaths they had been holding for far too long, exchanging glances that carried unspoken words. Some looked at Zuri, some at her mother, others at the place where Hayes had sat just moments ago, before he was escorted away, his wrists bound, his future no longer his own. There was no applause, no cheers, no celebration. It was not that kind of victory. It was quiet, heavy, something that felt almost too big to name, something that stretched far beyond this single room, this single case, this single man. Because this wasn't just about Daniel Hayes. It was about every Daniel Hayes before him, and every Daniel Hayes that would come after him, and the question of whether this moment was an exception or a shift in the tide. Judge Vanessa Parker had not moved from her place on the bench, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable, her hands still resting with deliberate calm on the polished wood. She had watched everything unfold with the same controlled precision she brought to every case, every ruling, every decision that had carried the weight of justice on her shoulders. But this had not been just another case, another ruling, another name on a list of defendants. This had been personal. This had been her daughter, her child, her blood, sitting in the front row with the uneven remains of what had once been a crown of thick, beautiful curls, a scar that would take time to heal, a reminder that some wounds cut deeper than the skin. And though she had spoken the verdict with the same unwavering authority as she always did, though she had maintained her composure as the sentence was delivered, though she had not let the world see the storm that raged beneath the surface, she was not unaffected. She finally turned, meeting Zuri's eyes, and in that single, brief exchange, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. "Are you okay?" "I will be." "Are you ready to leave?" "Yes." As they rose from their seats, the world outside was waiting. The steps of the courthouse were flooded with reporters, with microphones, with cameras flashing in rapid succession, capturing every second, every movement, every expression. The questions began immediately, voices overlapping, pressing, pushing, demanding statements, reactions, answers. Did justice prevail today? Do you believe the sentencing was enough? What message does this send to law enforcement? How does Zuri feel after today's verdict? But Vanessa Parker did not stop. She did not slow. She did not give them more than they deserved. She walked with steady, deliberate steps, her hand at the small of her daughter's back, guiding her forward through the chaos, shielding her from the relentless intrusion of a world that wanted to turn her trauma into a headline, her pain into a spectacle. Only once did she speak, her voice carrying over the noise, clear, steady, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Justice was served. And then, nothing more. Zuri did not turn back. She did not look at the cameras, did not stop to answer the questions, did not acknowledge the eyes that followed her, waiting for a reaction, a moment of vulnerability, a sign of what she was feeling. Because what she felt was hers, and hers alone. Not for the public. Not for the cameras. Not for anyone but herself. The car was waiting, the doors opening smoothly as they approached. Zuri slid into the passenger seat, feeling the weight of the courthouse fade behind her as her mother settled into the driver's side, the world outside muffled now, distant, unimportant. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, it was just them again. A silence settled, but it was not the heavy, suffocating kind that had filled the air in the days leading up to the trial. It was peaceful, a quiet that carried something close to relief, close to closure, but not quite. Because this wasn't the end. This wasn't the moment where everything suddenly became okay, where the damage was erased, where the past was undone. But it was a beginning. Her mother finally spoke, her voice softer now, no longer the commanding force that had ruled the courtroom. "Are you okay?" Zuri exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing against the uneven edges of her hair, the short strands that would take time to grow, to feel like hers again, to reclaim. "Yeah," she said after a moment, and this time, she meant it. Her mother nodded, starting the engine, pulling away from the courthouse, watching as it grew smaller in the rearview mirror. Neither of them looked back. Zuri gazed out the window, watching the city move past, the streets alive, the people carrying on with their day, the world still turning, still breathing, still existing as it always had. But something was different now. Something had shifted. Something had changed. Not just for her. Not just for her mother. But for everyone who had been in that courtroom, who had seen, who had watched, who had understood that today, justice had not looked the other way. And maybe, just maybe, it never would again. The car moved steadily through the streets of Baltimore, the courthouse growing smaller in the rearview mirror, but the weight of everything that had just happened still lingered, pressing against the silence inside the vehicle like a force neither of them could fully shake. The city carried on as it always did, cars honking in the distance, people walking with hurried steps, conversations happening at street corners, life resuming as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis inside that courtroom. But for Zuri, everything felt different. She wasn't sure if it was relief or exhaustion or something in between, but she could feel it, sitting deep in her chest, wrapping around her ribs like something heavy but no longer unbearable. The moment was over, but the consequences would stretch far beyond this day. Her mother hadn't spoken since they had left the courthouse, her hands firm on the steering wheel, her face composed, the same controlled presence she had carried through the entire trial still intact. But Zuri knew better. She knew that behind that unreadable expression was a storm of emotions, thoughts colliding, memories resurfacing, decisions being weighed. She could feel it in the air between them, unspoken but present, alive, waiting to be acknowledged. Vanessa finally exhaled, a long, measured breath, her fingers tightening slightly on the wheel before she spoke, her voice softer than it had been in days, lower, almost cautious, as if she was testing the waters of a conversation neither of them knew how to start. "Do you feel like justice was served today?" Zuri's fingers instinctively brushed against her hair, or what was left of it, her touch light, hesitant, feeling the uneven patches, the places where her curls had been stolen from her, the memory of that moment still sharp, still raw, still too vivid to ignore. She thought about what had happened in that courtroom, about the way Hayes had sat there, still clinging to some desperate, fading hope that he could talk his way out of it, that he could bend the world back in his favor like he had done so many times before. She thought about the verdict, the word that had sent a ripple through the room, the way everything had shifted the moment guilty was spoken aloud. She thought about the cameras, the flashing lights, the way the world had watched this moment unfold like something out of a movie, but this wasn't a story, wasn't a script, this was her life. She exhaled slowly before answering, her voice steady but laced with something deeper, something unresolved. I don't know, she admitted, watching as the buildings blurred past the window. It feels different than I thought it would. Vanessa glanced at her briefly before turning her attention back to the road, her expression unreadable, but Zuri knew that meant she was listening, really listening. Different how? Zuri hesitated, trying to find the right words, trying to make sense of the conflicting emotions swirling inside her. I thought I'd feel relieved. Like it would fix everything. Like once he was found guilty, once he was taken away, it would be over. That I'd feel whole again. But I don't. Her fingers clenched against her jeans, frustration creeping into her voice. He's going to prison, he lost everything, but it doesn't change what he did. It doesn't change how it felt when he did it. It doesn't bring back what he took from me. The words hung between them for a moment, heavy, sharp, impossible to ignore. Vanessa nodded slowly, considering her daughter's words, letting them settle before responding, her voice still calm but carrying the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding the limits of justice. That's the part they don't tell you, she said quietly. Justice doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't take away the pain. It doesn't undo what's already been done. Her grip on the wheel tightened slightly, her voice carrying something that almost sounded like regret. It just makes sure there's a consequence for it. Zuri looked at her mother then, really looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something she hadn't noticed before, the exhaustion behind her eyes, the weight of years of fighting battles that never seemed to end, the quiet resignation of someone who had spent her life seeking justice but had never been naive enough to believe it was the same thing as healing. Zuri swallowed hard, her chest tightening. Does it ever feel like enough? Vanessa was quiet for a long moment, the hum of the car the only sound between them. Then, finally, she sighed. Sometimes, she admitted. For a little while. But then another case comes. Another name. Another story that feels too familiar. And you realize there's always another battle waiting. She glanced at her daughter again, this time her expression softer, more vulnerable than it had been all day. But that doesn't mean you stop fighting. Zuri turned her gaze back to the window, watching the city move, feeling the truth of her mother's words settle into her bones. She thought about what it meant, to fight even when it never felt like enough, to stand even when the weight of injustice threatened to knock you down, to keep going even when the victories were small and the wounds were deep. She let out a slow breath, her fingers brushing against her hair again, this time with a little less hesitation, a little less sadness. I don't want to just be the girl who got her head shaved by a cop, she said after a moment, her voice quiet but firm. I don't want that to be my story. Vanessa's lips pressed together, something flickering in her eyes, something like pride, something like understanding. It won't be, she promised. Not if you don't let it. The words settled into Zuri's chest, deep and steady, something to hold on to, something to carry forward. The car rolled to a stop in front of their home, the familiar sight of their brownstone standing strong, unchanged, a place that had always been theirs, safe, untouched by the outside world, until now. Vanessa put the car in park but didn't move, her hand still resting on the wheel, her posture still poised, composed, but Zuri could tell there was more she wanted to say. Do you want to talk to someone? Vanessa asked finally, her voice careful, not pushing, just offering. A therapist, a counselor, someone who can help you process all of this? Zuri thought about it. She had spent so much time trying to be strong, trying to hold everything together, trying to convince herself that she didn't need help, that she could handle it on her own. But maybe strength wasn't just about enduring. Maybe it was about knowing when to let someone else carry some of the weight. She nodded slowly, and Vanessa didn't press her for more, didn't make a big deal out of it, just reached over and gently squeezed her hand, grounding her, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this. They sat there for a moment, the weight of everything settling but not suffocating, the beginning of something new unfolding between them, not just justice, not just closure, but the first steps toward healing. Finally, Vanessa exhaled, a small but real smile touching her lips. "Let's go inside, baby," she said, her voice filled with the warmth that had always made Zuri feel safe. And this time, as they stepped out of the car and walked up the front steps together, Zuri felt lighter than she had in days. The weight of everything that had happened still clung to the air as Vanessa and Zuri stepped through the front door of their home, the familiar scent of their space offering a sense of normalcy that felt distant, almost out of reach. The house was still the same, the walls painted in warm tones, the framed photographs lining the hallway, capturing years of memories that now felt like echoes from a different lifetime, a time before that day, before the trial, before Zuri had learned firsthand what it meant to be humiliated in front of the world and then watched justice try to put her back together again. Vanessa closed the door behind them, locking it, sealing them away from the outside world, at least for a little while. The sounds of the city faded into the background, leaving only the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant hum of the refrigerator. It should have felt comforting, safe, like a return to something familiar, but Zuri could still feel the weight in her chest, the tightness in her throat that she couldn't quite shake. She wasn't sure if it was exhaustion or something deeper, something she hadn't yet named. She dropped her backpack near the couch, kicking off her shoes, her movements slower than usual, heavier. Her mother watched her for a long moment before speaking, her voice careful, measured, as if she was choosing her words with the precision of a surgeon. "You don't have to pretend you're okay," she finally said, her tone soft but firm, a quiet permission for Zuri to unravel if she needed to. Zuri didn't answer immediately. Instead, she ran a hand over her head again, fingers grazing over the uneven patches where her hair had been taken from her. She thought she had already processed it, had already accepted it, but standing in her home, away from the cameras, away from the courtroom, away from the world, the reality of it hit differently. This was the first time she was alone with it, the first time she wasn't holding herself together because she had to. She could feel her mother's gaze on her, waiting, patient, not pushing but not looking away either. Her fingers tightened into a fist at her side before she finally spoke, her voice quieter than before, but filled with something raw. "I keep thinking about the moment it happened," she admitted, her throat tightening. "About the way it felt when he grabbed me, when he pressed those clippers against my head. I remember the way the crowd just stood there, watching, recording, but not stopping him. I remember how small I felt. Like I wasn't even a person, like I was just something to be dealt with. Like I didn't matter." Vanessa inhaled sharply, but she didn't interrupt, didn't rush in to reassure her that she did matter, that she was important, that she was more than what happened to her. She let Zuri speak, let her voice carry the weight it needed to. Zuri's jaw clenched. "And then I think about today. About seeing him sitting there, knowing he was the one who had no control this time. Knowing that for once, he was the one with no power, no way out. And I thought that would make it better. I thought that would be enough." She exhaled sharply, frustration slipping into her tone. "But it's not. It's not enough. Because it doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change that I still feel like I lost something that I can't get back." Vanessa sat down on the couch, motioning for Zuri to join her. Zuri hesitated before moving, sitting beside her, pulling her legs up and wrapping her arms around her knees. Her mother turned slightly, looking at her with an expression Zuri had seen before, but never quite understood until now. It was a kind of pain that wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, it was deep, buried, familiar. "I wish I could tell you that justice always makes things right," Vanessa said after a moment, her voice carrying something heavy, something worn. "I wish I could tell you that once a guilty verdict is read, once a sentence is handed down, everything just heals. But the truth is, justice doesn't undo the pain. It doesn't erase the past. It doesn't give back what was taken. She exhaled slowly, folding her hands in her lap. It just makes sure that the person who took it from you doesn't get to walk away like it never happened. Zuri swallowed hard, staring at the floor, letting those words settle in, sink into the parts of her that still felt raw, still felt broken. So what now? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. What do I do with this? With the fact that I don't feel whole anymore? Vanessa didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached over, gently taking Zuri's hand in hers, her grip warm, strong, steady. You start taking back the things he tried to take from you, she said softly. Piece by piece, moment by moment. You remind yourself that you are not what happened to you. You remind yourself that you are more than that day, more than that moment, more than him. You decide what your story is, not him. Not them. You. Zuri blinked rapidly, trying to keep the tears from falling, but failing. She hated crying, hated the way it made her feel vulnerable, exposed. But her mother didn't pull away. She just held her hand, let her feel it, let her have this moment without telling her to be strong or to move on. I don't know how to do that, Zuri admitted, her voice breaking slightly. Vanessa squeezed her hand gently. You don't have to know right now, she reassured her. You just have to start. However small, however slow. You start. Zuri sniffed, nodding slightly, not fully believing it yet, but wanting to. Wanting to believe that healing was possible, even if it didn't come all at once, even if it didn't come with a dramatic moment of clarity, even if it was just a series of small steps that felt like nothing until one day, they weren't nothing anymore. Her mother gave her a soft smile, standing up and stretching slightly, as if shaking off the weight of the conversation. Come on, she said, her voice lighter now, a little less heavy. Let's get something to eat. You barely touched your food today. Zuri wiped at her eyes quickly, nodding, following her mother into the kitchen. The normalcy of it felt strange at first, the act of existing in a space where the world hadn't crumbled, where things still went on as if nothing had happened. But maybe that was part of it, too. Maybe healing wasn't just about processing the pain. Maybe it was also about learning how to exist beyond it. She sat at the kitchen counter as her mother moved around, pulling out leftovers, heating up food, filling plates like it was any other day. And in a way, maybe it was. Maybe the world had changed. Maybe she had changed. But the simple things, a warm meal, her mother's presence, the feeling of home still standing solid around her, those things were still there. Maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start. The months that followed were different, not because life suddenly became easy, not because the weight of what had happened disappeared overnight, but because Zuri was no longer carrying it the same way. The stares at school didn't bother her like they once did, the hushed conversations whenever she walked past no longer felt like a blade pressing against her skin. People knew what had happened, they had seen it, read about it, watched the clips circulate through every news outlet, every social media platform. They had witnessed the public dismantling of a man who had spent years believing he would never face consequences. Some people looked at her with pity, others with admiration, some with discomfort, as if they didn't know how to process the fact that she had survived something so cruel and still stood unshaken. But that was the thing, she wasn't just surviving anymore. Her hair had started growing back, each curl reclaiming its place, defying the violation that had tried to strip her of them. She no longer hesitated before looking in the mirror, no longer flinched when her fingers ran over the short strands. It was hers again, every inch of it, every part of her identity that had been taken was slowly, steadily, coming back, stronger than before. She had won, not just in that courtroom, but in the quiet moments afterward, in the nights she didn't cry herself to sleep, in the mornings she woke up and felt lighter than the day before. She had taken back what was hers. Her mother had changed, too. Vanessa had always been a force, had always carried herself with the kind of confidence that made people listen before she even spoke. But after the trial, there was something sharper in her, something even more resolute. She had taken what happened to her daughter personally, had turned her focus toward the systems that allowed people like Hayes to thrive unchecked for so long. She didn't just punish him, she started dismantling the very foundation that had protected him. She used her influence, her power, her unshakable voice, and the world listened. Cases were re-examined, policies were challenged, and suddenly, there were doors opening that had been shut for too long. She made sure that this moment wouldn't just be about her daughter, but about every child who had ever been silenced, every person who had ever been forced to shrink themselves under the weight of injustice. And Hayes? Prison changed him, but not in the way he had hoped. He had walked into those walls expecting the same protection, the same privileges, the same unearned grace that had always been extended to him in the outside world. But inside those walls, he was nothing. He was just another inmate, stripped of the uniform that had once given him power, stripped of the illusion that he was better than the people he had spent years brutalizing. There were no shields here, no authority to hide behind, no badge to flash when he needed an easy way out. For the first time in his life, he was at the mercy of a system he could no longer manipulate. And the world had moved on without him. Zuri didn't think about him much anymore. He had occupied too much space in her mind for too long, had taken up too much of her energy, had stolen too many of her hours. But now, she had more important things to focus on. She had started writing. The words came easier than she expected, pouring onto the pages of her notebook, spilling out of her like they had been waiting for permission to exist. At first, she wrote about what had happened, about the day outside the courthouse, about the way the crowd had watched, about the powerlessness she had felt in that moment and the power she had reclaimed afterward. But soon, the words grew into something more, stories about strength, about defiance, about what it meant to be young and black in a world that still tried to shrink her. She wrote because it felt like taking back control, because every sentence, every paragraph, every page felt like a victory. One day, her mother found the notebook, flipping through the pages with careful hands, her expression unreadable at first. Then, she smiled, slow and proud, a smile that said she saw her daughter not just as someone who had endured, but as someone who was shaping the world with her voice. "You should share these," Vanessa had said, her voice quiet but firm. "People need to hear what you have to say." Zuri had hesitated at first, unsure, but eventually, she did. She started posting online, sharing her words with the world, not expecting much, just wanting them to exist somewhere outside of her own mind. But the world listened. People read, they shared, they reached out, telling her that her words had touched something in them, that they had felt seen in ways they hadn't before. She had turned her pain into something powerful. One evening, as she sat in her room, laptop open, scrolling through the messages, she felt something settle inside her, a quiet kind of peace, a certainty that she had reclaimed her own narrative. She wasn't just the girl who had been humiliated outside a courthouse. She wasn't just the victim of a racist cop's abuse of power. She was more. She had always been more. And now, the world knew it, too. Sometimes, people asked if she would ever forgive Hayes. If she would ever let go of the anger, the resentment, the lingering remnants of what he had done. She never gave them the answer they wanted. Forgiveness wasn't something owed. It wasn't something she had to give for the sake of closure, for the sake of moving on, for the sake of being perceived as someone who had taken the higher road. Forgiveness wasn't necessary for healing. She didn't need to forgive him to be free of him. She was free already. And that was the only ending that mattered. Now, let's take a moment to reflect. What does justice mean to you? Is it punishment? Is it accountability? Is it change? This story was not just about one officer or one girl. It was about a system, a pattern, a reality that too many people face and too few people acknowledge. How many times have we watched injustice unfold in front of us, only to turn away, to say nothing, to assume it is someone else's battle to fight? How many times have we let power go unchecked, convinced that speaking up won't change anything? But what this story shows us, what Zuri's journey proves, is that change starts with defiance, with refusing to shrink, with reclaiming your own story. So, what would you have done if you had been there that day? Would you have watched? Would you have spoken up? Would you have fought for justice, even when it wasn't easy? Let's talk about it in the comments. Let's have the conversations that need to be had. Because silence has never been the solution. And if you want more stories like this, stories that challenge, that provoke, that demand to be felt, make sure you subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because the world is full of stories that deserve to be told. And we're just getting started.